It was a cold, gray morning in Michigan when the police were called to the scene of a gruesome crime, a massacre that would leave the entire town of Willow Creek in shock. A family of 5 had been slaughtered in their home, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. The victims, the husband, David Miller, his wife Karen, and their 3 children, Emily, age 14, Luke, age 10, and Sophie, age 6. The house, once filled with the warmth of family life, was now a crime scene, a place where tragedy had struck hard. The bodies were found in the living room, their lives taken in an unspeakable act of violence. David Miller, a quiet man by all accounts, was the prime suspect. But the investigation would reveal a dark secret, one buried in the past of the Miller family, a secret that would explain why David's rage had erupted in such a horrifying way. Detective Sarah McConnell arrived at the scene, her heart heavy with the gravity of what had happened. She had seen her fair share of brutal crimes, but this one was different. The Miller family had always been seen as perfect by their neighbors, perfectly ordinary, perfectly happy. So what could have driven David to murder his own family? Her first task was to talk to the neighbors, hoping to find some clue, something that could shed light on the man who had just killed his family. As she approached the house, the cold wind whipped through the trees, the bare branches swaying ominously. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on her as she made her way to the front door. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman in her mid-50s, her face pale with shock. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect— is it really him?" she asked, her voice shaky. McConnell nodded somberly. "Yes, ma'am, we're investigating what happened here. Were you close to the Miller family?" The woman, whose name was Carol, nodded. "We've lived next door for years. David, he was a quiet man, always polite, but something changed about a year ago. I don't know, he just seemed different, more distant. He and Karen started fighting more, and I heard shouting sometimes, but nothing serious. Or at least, that's what I thought." "Did you hear anything last night?" McConnell asked, her mind racing with questions. Carol hesitated before answering. "Now that you mention it, I did hear something. Around 2 a.m. it was loud. David yelling, Karen crying, then silence. It was strange." McConnell made a mental note of the information. "Thank you. If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to contact us." She turned to the officers and nodded for them to begin their work. As she made her way into the house, she was struck by how ordinary it looked. The furniture was neat, the walls adorned with family photos. It didn't look like a place where violence could happen, but now it was the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. The bodies had already been removed, but the bloodstains remained, splattered across the floor and smeared on the walls. David Miller's fingerprints were all over the weapons found at the scene, but McConnell knew that something didn't add up. Why would a man, a father, commit such a violent act? What was the motive? McConnell sat down at the kitchen table, trying to piece together the puzzle. She pulled out her notebook and began writing down everything she knew so far. David Miller, a quiet, reserved man; Karen Miller, a loving wife and mother; and 3 innocent children. They had no criminal history, no financial troubles, nothing that would explain this kind of rage. And yet something had triggered it. Her instincts told her that there was more to this than met the eye. Detective Sarah McConnell spent the next few days digging into the history of the Miller family. She had an inkling that something far deeper than domestic disputes or simple arguments had led to the massacre. As she sifted through the case files and spoke with neighbors, friends, and colleagues of David and Karen Miller, a pattern began to emerge. The Miller family seemed perfect on the surface, but McConnell knew that appearances could be deceiving. David had always been a reserved man, never too eager to share much about his life. His wife, Karen, had been a stay-at-home mom who was loved by everyone in the neighborhood. The children were typical, bright, happy, and well-behaved. But McConnell had learned one crucial detail. David Miller's father, Richard Miller, had recently passed away. The timing of his death, just weeks before the murders, seemed to be too significant to ignore. The estate left behind by Richard Miller was substantial. The elderly man had been a successful businessman, and his will was the focal point of much family tension. McConnell knew that families often turned on each other when money and inheritance were involved. But this was different. David's name had been conspicuously absent from his father's will. McConnell's investigation led her to the executor of Richard's will, a lawyer named Robert Stevens. She met with him in his office, a modern building located in downtown Michigan. Stevens was in his late 50s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor. When McConnell explained the situation, he looked uneasy. "I'm afraid there's a lot more to this than you think, Detective," Stevens said, pulling a thick folder from his desk drawer. "David and his father had a complicated relationship." McConnell leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean by complicated?" David was never happy with his father's will. Richard had 3 children, but only 2 of them. David's younger brother Mark and his sister Linda were named in the inheritance. David was completely left out, Stevens explained, flipping through the folder. Richard's reasons were clear. He believed David wasn't responsible enough to handle the family fortune. He even wrote in the will that David was unfit to take on such a responsibility. McConnell's eyes widened. So David was cut out of the will completely? Not only that, Stevens continued, David's father had always been an extremely wealthy man, but the inheritance also came with conditions. Mark and Linda were to oversee the family business, while David was given a small trust fund, but nothing of significant value. David's anger toward his father had been building for years, but it reached a breaking point when Richard died. He had always been a hard man, and David never measured up to his expectations. This was the final straw. McConnell could feel the tension in her shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. David's lack of inheritance had likely fueled an overwhelming sense of resentment. But what drove him to murder his family? McConnell knew that David's anger toward his father had been simmering for years. But the ultimate betrayal came when David learned that his father had left everything to his younger siblings, while he was cast aside as though he didn't matter. "Did David ever talk about his father's will?" McConnell asked. Stevens hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There were rumors. David didn't take it well. He tried to argue with Richard's lawyer, but Richard refused to reconsider. David seemed to think that by his father's standards, he was always going to be a failure. And from what I know, he had begun to resent Karen as well. She was the one who encouraged him to fight for what he felt was rightfully his. But Karen also knew that David was incapable of running the family business. I think she saw this deep down." McConnell thought about that for a moment. Was it possible that David's rage wasn't just about money? Was there a deeper sense of betrayal from his own family, a feeling of never being good enough? "There were rumors," McConnell repeated. "About what?" "David had begun to talk about revenge," Stevens said, his voice lowering. "I'm not sure how serious he was, but he spoke of his father's rejection like a betrayal. He even said he wouldn't stop until he was the one in charge." McConnell's stomach churned. David Miller had felt wrong for so long that he had become consumed by a thirst for revenge. But that didn't explain the horrific murder of his wife and children. Could it be that Karen had become collateral damage in David's quest for power and wealth? Or was she somehow a part of this twisted plan? McConnell left Stevens' office feeling more disturbed than ever. She had learned about David's sense of inadequacy and his rage, but the full scope of what had happened in the Miller household still wasn't clear. What exactly had driven David to massacre his family? She was beginning to suspect that David's deep psychological issues had pushed him over the edge. Her next step was to talk to Karen's family. If David's resentment had been so deep, maybe Karen had noticed the signs of his anger and frustration. Maybe she had even seen a side of David that no one else had. That afternoon, McConnell met with Karen's parents, Michael and Susan Reynolds. They lived in a modest house just outside of Willow Creek. The couple had raised Karen in a loving home, and McConnell was hoping they might have some insight into her relationship with David. Michael and Susan were in their late 50s, and they appeared to be in shock over the murder of their daughter and grandchildren. They spoke quietly, their grief palpable. "David was always distant with us," Susan said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "But Karen loved him. She truly did. She believed in him, even when he couldn't see his own worth. I don't know what went wrong. What made him do this?" McConnell looked at Susan, trying to read her. Had Karen ever mentioned any trouble in her marriage? Did she ever seem afraid of David? Susan shook her head. her face filled with confusion. No, not really. Karen was always such a strong woman. She never would have put herself or the children in danger. But I do know that she was worried about David, especially after Richard's death. He changed after that. He became so obsessed with the idea of revenge. I think Karen wanted to help him, but she was scared of what he might do. I think she knew he was capable of something terrible. McConnell nodded grimly. This was the confirmation she had been hoping for. Karen had sensed the danger in her husband's mind but had been unable to stop it. The marriage, once filled with love, had turned into something toxic, a battleground where resentment festered. The investigation was pointing in one direction. David Miller had killed his family, driven by jealousy, anger, and a thirst for power. But there were still questions left unanswered. Why had he taken such drastic action? And why hadn't he stopped before it was too late? McConnell knew that the key to solving the case lay in the unraveling of David's psychology, the deep wounds that had festered inside him for years, and the violent eruption that had followed. Detective McConnell couldn't shake the chilling image of David Miller's face, the face of a man who had been driven to commit the unthinkable. But with each conversation, piece of evidence, and clue she uncovered, the more she realized that the case was not as straightforward as it appeared. David wasn't just a man angry about a will. Something deeper had been festering in his mind for years. But what was it? What had truly pushed David to slaughter his wife and children in such a violent, calculated manner? The more McConnell thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together. She began to focus on David's relationship with his father, Richard. While Richard's will was certainly the trigger for much of David's frustration, McConnell now wondered if something even darker was behind David's need to destroy everything he had once loved. That's when McConnell received an unexpected lead. The key to understanding David's motives might lie in the family's past, specifically in a secret that had been buried for years, something David himself had never known until it was too late. A breakthrough came when McConnell obtained a letter from Richard Miller's personal attorney, which had been sealed in an envelope marked as confidential. The letter, dated 5 years before Richard's death, was addressed to David, though it had never been delivered. It was a final message from Richard to his son, and it contained information that no one, least of all David, had ever known. The letter revealed a horrifying truth. David was not Richard's biological son. Richard Miller had been involved in an extramarital affair many years ago, and as it turned out, David was the product of that affair. Richard had never told David, and David had grown up believing he was his biological child. But the truth was more complicated, and this revelation, hidden away for years, was devastating. McConnell sat in her office, staring at the letter in disbelief. She had to read it over and over again before the full gravity of its contents sank in. Richard Miller had known the truth all along, but had kept it hidden. The man David had always sought approval from, his father, who had rejected him so harshly in the will, was not even his biological parent. This information, buried deep within the family's history, explained so much. David had been raised with the belief that he was the rightful heir to his father's fortune, the heir to the family's legacy. But the truth shattered everything. David had always felt a sense of inadequacy and resentment toward his father, but now that resentment had transformed into a need for revenge. Richard had treated him like a failure, cast him aside, but David had never known that his very identity had been a lie. McConnell realized that David's act of violence wasn't just about money or power. It was about a lifetime of rejection and betrayal. David's family had never truly been his family. He had been living a lie, and the anger he had suppressed for years finally exploded. The more McConnell uncovered, the more she understood the complexity of David's emotions. It wasn't just the will that had set him off, the discovery that his father had never truly accepted him, that the very man who had cast him aside wasn't even his biological parent, had driven David to madness. The will had been the final straw, but the foundation of David's rage was much deeper, rooted in a childhood of lies and abandonment. McConnell quickly knew that this discovery was key to understanding David's mindset. But there were still unanswered questions. Why hadn't David ever confronted Richard about his true parentage? Why had Richard kept the secret for so long? And why had he never told David the truth? To find the answers, McConnell would have to dig deeper into Richard's life, especially his relationship with the woman who had been David's biological mother. She knew this could take her into territory that might be uncomfortable, but she was prepared to follow the trail wherever it led. Her first stop was the town's local nursing home. David's biological mother, a woman named Grace Miller, had lived there for years after a stroke left her unable to care for herself. Grace had been the woman Richard had had the affair with, but she had never revealed her son's true parentage. For years she had lived in obscurity, out of the public eye, but now she might hold the final piece of the puzzle. McConnell arrived at the nursing home and asked to speak with Grace. An elderly nurse led her to a small room where Grace sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the bleak, snowy landscape. The old woman was frail, her hair thin and gray, and her face lined with age. But when McConnell introduced herself and explained why she was there, Grace's eyes seemed to light up with recognition. "Oh, detective," Grace whispered, her voice faint. "I've been waiting for someone to come. I've been waiting for someone to know the truth." McConnell sat down next to her. "What truth, Mrs. Miller?" "The truth about David," Grace said, tears welling up in her eyes. "He didn't deserve what happened to him. He was always a good boy, but he was never allowed to know who he really was." Grace told McConnell that she had loved Richard once, but their affair had been short-lived. She had been a young woman, and Richard had been a powerful man, charming, successful, but ultimately cruel. After their affair ended, Richard had promised Grace that he would take care of her and their child. But when he discovered that Grace was pregnant, he had turned his back on her. "He was so angry, detective," Grace whispered. "He didn't want anyone to know. I begged him to let David know the truth, but Richard refused. He wanted to keep his perfect image. He didn't want anyone to know about the affair, about David. I tried to raise him the best I could, but Richard never let me be a mother to him. I couldn't tell David who his real father was. He would have hated me, but I loved him." Grace's voice trailed off as she recalled the painful years that followed. Richard had never been a part of David's life, and David had grown up with the knowledge that his mother was the only one who cared for him. But Richard's rejection had left scars that no amount of love could heal. And now McConnell understood. David had been carrying the weight of that rejection for years, believing that his father's harsh treatment was his fault. The realization that his father wasn't even his biological parent had shattered him completely. McConnell left the nursing home, her mind spinning with everything she had learned. David's violent outburst wasn't just about a father's rejection. It was about a lifetime of lies and pain. He had been betrayed by the one person he had trusted the most, and that betrayal had driven him to murder. But the mystery wasn't over yet. David's actions still didn't fully explain the horrific nature of the crime. Why had he chosen to kill his wife and children along with his father's betrayal? McConnell knew she was close to uncovering the final piece of the puzzle. Detective McConnell's mind raced as she left the nursing home. Everything she had uncovered so far about David Miller was pointing toward a much deeper and more complex psychological fracture than she had initially imagined. His rage wasn't just fueled by his father's will or the fact that he had been denied a place in Richard Miller's estate. It was the culmination of years of abandonment, emotional neglect, and the crushing realization that the man he had spent his entire life trying to impress was not even his real father. But as McConnell walked toward her car, one thought lingered in her mind. Why had David murdered his entire family? His wife, Samantha, and their 3 young children, David, 12, Lily, 9, and the youngest, Sam Jr., just 4 years old, hadn't been the target of his anger before. They were innocent victims in a tragedy that seemed to go far beyond family wealth or inheritance. McConnell had already pieced together the connection between David's deep resentment of his father and his deadly act of violence. But she needed more answers. Why were his children and wife dragged into this tragedy? What role had they played in David's sudden spiral into madness? The key, McConnell realized, might lie in David's relationship with his wife, Samantha. She had always been portrayed as a loving, supportive partner, an ideal match for David. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. McConnell decided to visit the Miller family's home one last time, this time with a renewed focus on understanding the dynamics within the family. The house was eerily quiet when McConnell arrived, the front door slightly ajar, as if it had been left in a rush. The crime scene had been thoroughly processed, but McConnell knew there was still more to learn. Perhaps there were signs of something more that had been missed during the initial investigation. She was led through the house by Officer Harris, who had been stationed there since the night of the killings. "Detective, we've gone over everything multiple times," Officer Harris said, his voice tight. "But I know you're looking for something different, something we might have missed." McConnell nodded. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she could feel it. There was something about the way the house had been left behind, something strange and unsettling that didn't sit right with her. The Miller family's home was spacious and well kept, but there was an air of discomfort hanging in the atmosphere. As McConnell walked through the rooms, she noticed the family photographs scattered across the walls. In each picture, David and Samantha appeared happy, their children smiling, their lives seemingly perfect. But McConnell could tell that these images were more than just photographs. They were evidence of the carefully constructed facade that had existed within the Miller household. She asked Officer Harris to show her to the couple's bedroom. It was immaculate, the bed neatly made, the room itself a picture of calm and order. But one thing caught McConnell's eye: the dresser. It had been knocked over during the chaos of the murder, the drawers spilling out onto the floor. McConnell knelt to inspect the contents, and among the scattered clothes, she found something that made her heart race: a stack of journals. Samantha's journals. She carefully picked up the first journal and opened it to a random page. The entries were mostly mundane: daily life, family routines, and notes about the children. But as McConnell flipped through the pages, she came across a section that caught her attention. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. David is changing. He's angry all the time, and it's getting worse. I'm afraid of what he might do, but I don't know how to leave. I don't have anywhere to go. I can't take the kids and leave, not without everything falling apart. But I can't stay like this. I have to figure out a way to escape before it's too late." McConnell's heart skipped a beat. Samantha had been living in fear of her husband long before the murder. The entries hinted at a darker side to David, a side that his family had been trying to ignore, but it had become increasingly difficult to hide. This was the first tangible evidence McConnell had that pointed to the unraveling of David's psyche in the weeks leading up to the murders. The journal entries were filled with painful revelations about David's volatile behavior, outbursts of rage, long periods of silence, and an overwhelming sense of control that he had begun to exert over Samantha. The deeper McConnell read, the more she realized that Samantha had been trying to hold everything together, all while bearing the weight of her husband's growing instability. Samantha had mentioned in her journals that David had begun to withdraw from their family. He had become obsessed with the idea that Richard's will had been the key to his life's failures, and McConnell now saw the toll that obsession had taken on him. It wasn't just about the inheritance. David's entire sense of identity had been tied to his father's approval, and once that approval was withheld, David had begun to deteriorate. But it wasn't just the inheritance or the father's rejection that had pushed David to murder. The real turning point, McConnell realized, had been the discovery that Samantha had been hiding a secret of her own, one that David had never known about. As McConnell flipped through the rest of the journal, she came across a letter tucked into the back cover. It was addressed to David, but the contents of the letter made McConnell's blood run cold. "David, I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to get this far. I tried to tell you, but I was too scared. You're not the father of our children. I thought I could hide it, but now I know I can't. You need to know the truth. I love you, but the past is catching up with us. I need you to understand that I never meant to hurt you, but the truth is out there, and it's going to destroy everything." McConnell felt her heart drop. Samantha had confessed to an affair, one that had been kept secret for years. David's children, the ones he had believed were his flesh and blood, were not his at all. The truth had finally come to light. David's entire world was a lie. Not only had his father rejected him, but his wife had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. The anger David had been carrying for years was now completely justified in his mind. He was not only abandoned by the man he thought was his father, but the woman he loved had been unfaithful to him. The weight of these revelations, coupled with the brutal rejection from his father, had broken him. McConnell now had the full picture. David's rage had been building for years, and when the truth about his children and his wife's infidelity came crashing down, he had snapped. He had murdered the woman he once loved and the children he thought were his own, all because of the crushing realization that his life had been nothing more than a series of lies. The motive behind the murders was clear now, but the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. Why had David gone to such extreme lengths to cover up his actions? Why had he gone so far as to butcher his family in such a horrific manner? McConnell knew that the answers lay hidden in David's mind, and it was only a matter of time before she would uncover the full truth. Detective McConnell sat in her office, looking over the case file for the 100th time. The horrific details of the Miller family murders were burned into her mind. David Miller had brutally killed his wife, Samantha, and their 3 children, before going to extraordinary lengths to cover up his actions. What had driven a man to such extremes? How had the perfect family image crumbled so completely, leading to such a devastating outcome? But McConnell was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She had been following the thread of family secrets, lies, and betrayal, and now she was getting closer to the final piece of the puzzle. After reading the confession letter from Samantha, she had learned that David's anger was compounded by the painful truth about his children. They weren't his. But what had happened after the murders? Why had David been so meticulous in his efforts to conceal his involvement? It was time to bring in someone who could help piece together the rest of David's descent into madness. McConnell knew that David's past was filled with unresolved emotions and trauma. In her years of experience, she had learned that sometimes the answers lay hidden within the most unexpected sources. McConnell decided to interview David's oldest friend, Tom Jenkins, someone who had known David since childhood. Tom had been a quiet, unassuming man, and McConnell hoped that his insights could shed light on David's state of mind. If anyone understood what had pushed David over the edge, it would be Tom. Tom sat across from McConnell in the interrogation room, his face lined with worry. His hands shook as he nervously fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. He had always been the type to avoid confrontation, but now he was being forced to confront the truth about his best friend, who had committed such a horrific act. "I still can't believe it," Tom said, his voice wavering. "David, he was always so quiet, but he wasn't a violent guy. He was a good husband, a good father." "I just don't understand." McConnell nodded, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. She had learned a lot about David, but she needed to know more. "Tell me about his relationship with his father, Richard. Did you ever notice any tension between them?" Tom paused, thinking for a moment before answering. "Yeah, there was always something off about David and his dad. Richard was a tough man, very old school. He had high expectations for David, and no matter what David did, it was never enough. I think that really got to him. David wanted to make his father proud, but Richard never acknowledged him the way he wanted. It was like he was constantly chasing after something that he could never reach." McConnell leaned forward. "Do you think that's what set David off? The rejection?" Tom's eyes grew distant as he remembered the past. David always wanted his father's approval. He worked so hard trying to prove that he was worthy of it. But Richard was a man of pride. I think David always felt like he was never good enough. And when Richard passed away, it crushed him. I'm sure it felt like his entire life had been a lie." McConnell nodded. It made sense. The rejection by David's father had been a deep wound, one that had festered for years. But the murder of David's family, that was something deeper, something more complicated. "I know this is hard," McConnell said gently, "but did you notice anything unusual about David's marriage to Samantha? Any signs that things weren't what they seemed?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding McConnell's gaze. "I don't know, Detective. Samantha, she was always sweet, always supportive. I don't think David ever would have suspected anything. But I could tell something had changed with him in the last few months. He started becoming distant, shutting people out. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something wasn't right." McConnell took a deep breath. "Did David ever mention his children?" Tom's face darkened. "He loved them, I know that. But he was so focused on work, on proving himself to his father that he was rarely there for them. He'd come home late and barely speak to Samantha. There was a lot of tension in the house, but no one ever really talked about it. They all kept up appearances, David, Samantha, the kids. It was like they were all playing roles in a play, trying to make everything look perfect, but it wasn't. McConnell made a note in her file. Tom's words confirmed the suspicion she had been forming, that David's obsession with his father's approval had destroyed his relationship with his family. But there was still one critical question to answer. Why had David chosen to murder his wife and children? Why not simply leave them? McConnell returned to the case file and reviewed the evidence. David had gone to great lengths to conceal his involvement in the murders. The crime scene had been staged to look like a botched robbery, and he had taken extreme measures to destroy any DNA evidence that might link him to the killings. David had also carefully manipulated his alibi, claiming he was at a business meeting when the murders occurred. But the inconsistencies in his story were starting to add up. He hadn't accounted for the confession letter, the journals, or his sudden decision to flee the state. David had planned every detail, and McConnell suspected that he had been harboring these violent tendencies for much longer than anyone realized. As McConnell reviewed the case again, she began to piece together a timeline of events that led to the murder. David had learned the truth about his children's paternity in the weeks before the killings. Samantha's affair had shattered him, not just because of the betrayal, but because it had exposed the fact that his entire life had been built on lies. His children weren't his, and the family he thought he had was nothing more than a facade. This revelation, coupled with his anger at his father's rejection, had driven David to the breaking point. But there was more to the story. McConnell had learned that David had been in contact with an old business partner shortly before the murders. The business partner, a man named James Armstrong, was known for his shady dealings and had been involved in some questionable ventures. McConnell suspected that David had sought out Armstrong's help in the aftermath of the murders, hoping to cover his tracks and escape from the law. McConnell's gut told her that Armstrong had played a pivotal role in the final steps of David's escape plan. But finding proof would take time. She would need to dig deeper into Armstrong's background and connections, and she would need to speak with more of David's friends and associates. The investigation was far from over, but McConnell was closing in on the truth. David Miller had destroyed his family in an act of vengeance, a final desperate attempt to take control of a life that had always eluded him. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, McConnell knew one thing for certain. She was going to uncover everything. Detective McConnell sat at her desk, a cup of cold coffee forgotten beside her, as she stared at the latest pieces of the puzzle. The more she uncovered, the more twisted and disturbing the case became. David Miller had committed an unimaginable crime, and she was closing in on the final pieces of the story. It had been nearly a month since the murders of Samantha and their 3 children, and while McConnell had managed to connect the dots between David and the crime scene, there were still too many unanswered questions. David's disappearance after the murders had baffled the authorities. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of half-baked alibis and lies that had once seemed airtight. But McConnell was no rookie. She knew the signs of a man on the run, and David had made one crucial mistake. He thought he could outrun the truth. It was late in the evening when McConnell received the phone call she'd been waiting for. The voice on the other end was familiar. James Armstrong, David's old business partner. He had agreed to speak with her after days of careful persuasion and promises of protection in exchange for his testimony. Detective McConnell, Armstrong's voice crackled through the line. I know why you're calling, but before we get into all that, you need to know something. If I talk, I'm done for. This is bigger than just David. McConnell's heart raced. She had been expecting this moment, but she wasn't prepared for the weight of the truth that Armstrong might reveal. What do you mean by bigger? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tell me what happened. What role did you play in the Miller case? There was a pause on the line. Armstrong let out a long sigh. David was never meant to go this far. I didn't think he would actually go through with it. But things got complicated. McConnell sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. Complicated how? David reached out to me a couple of weeks before the murders, Armstrong continued. He was desperate. He was spiraling after learning about his kids not being his. And then he started talking about his father, Richard, about how he felt rejected and overlooked his whole life. It was like the man was losing his mind. He wanted to start fresh, start over with a clean slate, and he thought killing his family would give him the freedom to do that. McConnell's hand tightened around the phone. This was the moment where she would finally understand David's motives. But you didn't stop him? You didn't try to help? Armstrong's voice faltered. I didn't know he would go that far. He talked about it, but I thought he was just venting. Then a few days before the killings, he called me again. He needed money, and he needed help to disappear. I didn't want any part of it, but I knew if I refused, he'd be more dangerous. So I helped him. McConnell felt a wave of disgust wash over her. So you're saying you helped him cover his tracks after the murders? Helped him get away with it? Armstrong's voice was filled with regret. I didn't know what to do. He was like a brother to me, and I thought I could talk him out of it. But I didn't know what had been building up inside of him. I had no idea he would go this far. You gave him the money, McConnell said, her voice flat, and you helped him get out of the state. I thought he needed a chance to cool off. But then I found out what he had really done, and I couldn't live with it anymore. That's when I decided to talk. McConnell took a deep breath. She had everything she needed now. Armstrong's confession was damning, but she still needed to find David. They were closing in on him, but the question was, where was he hiding? McConnell immediately dispatched a team to track down Armstrong's movements after his meeting with David. They uncovered a series of untraceable transactions, all pointing to a remote cabin in the Michigan wilderness. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear, isolated, hidden from the prying eyes of law enforcement. With a team assembled, McConnell set out for the cabin, knowing that the final confrontation with David Miller was imminent. This was the moment of truth. When they arrived, McConnell ordered her team to take positions around the cabin. The dense forest and thick trees provided perfect cover, but McConnell wasn't about to let her guard down. David was cornered. There was nowhere left for him to run. As McConnell approached the cabin with her team, she could hear the faint sounds of movement from inside. The wooden structure creaked underfoot, and the stale air of the forest seemed to weigh down on her. Her pulse quickened as they reached the door. She signaled for the team to hold. With a swift motion, McConnell kicked the door open, her weapon raised. She had prepared herself for anything, but what she found inside was beyond what she had imagined. David Miller was sitting at the center of the small cabin, his face drawn and pale. His eyes were vacant, as though he had already accepted his fate. A bottle of whiskey sat beside him, and the room smelled of stale alcohol and sweat. His hands trembled as he slowly raised them in surrender. I knew you'd come for me, David said, his voice empty, devoid of emotion. McConnell stepped forward, her weapon still raised. David Miller, you're under arrest for the murders of your wife, Samantha, and your 3 children. You're also being charged with conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. David's gaze met hers, and for a moment, he seemed almost relieved. I never wanted to hurt them, he whispered, but I couldn't live with the lies anymore. I had to make it stop. You could have walked away, McConnell said, her voice cold. But instead, you chose murder. David's eyes darkened as he looked down at his trembling hands. I thought it would fix everything, but now I see it didn't. Nothing ever will. As McConnell cuffed David and led him outside, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. A man had destroyed his entire family in an attempt to escape the lies that had tormented him. But in the end, there was no escape, no redemption, only the stark reality of the consequences. David Miller would face justice for his actions, but the scars left on the community, on the families affected, would last long after the trial. It was a reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets fester in the places we least expect, and that the truth, no matter how painful, always finds its way to the surface. The courtroom was packed, a palpable tension hanging in the air. The trial of David Miller had attracted attention across Michigan, and the media were eager to report every detail of the once prominent preacher's fall from grace. It had been 6 months since David was captured in the cabin, and now the victims, Samantha, the 3 children, and the community they once belonged to, were waiting for justice. Detective McConnell sat near the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the defendant. David looked a shadow of the man he once was. His previously well-groomed appearance had been replaced by a scruffy beard, unkempt hair, and a haunted expression. The man who had once been a pillar of his community was now a broken shell, his every movement weighed down by guilt and regret. The defense attorney was doing his best to paint David as a victim of circumstances, citing the trauma of his father's rejection and the heartbreak of discovering that his children were not his own. He argued that David had been pushed to the brink by years of emotional abuse and feelings of abandonment. But McConnell knew the truth. She had seen firsthand how David's delusions had led him to commit the unspeakable. His motives weren't just rooted in personal pain, they were driven by his inability to confront the consequences of his actions and his desperate need to escape from the tangled web of lies he had created. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's case seemed airtight. Armstrong, David's former business partner, had provided the key testimony that had led them to David in the cabin. His confession had sealed David's fate, and McConnell was confident that the jury would find him guilty. Still, as the trial continued, McConnell couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. The pieces had fit together too perfectly, and David's story seemed too simple, too convenient. It wasn't until the defense called its final witness that McConnell's suspicions were confirmed. The witness was Richard Miller, David's estranged father. Richard had kept his distance from his son for years, but now he was being called to testify. The old man took the stand with a stoic expression, his demeanor calm and controlled. His presence in the courtroom added a layer of complexity to the case. To McConnell, it was clear that Richard's relationship with his son had shaped the events leading up to the murders. As Richard took the stand, David's eyes flickered briefly in his direction, but he quickly looked away. The tension in the room was thick as Richard addressed the jury. "I never wanted David to feel abandoned," Richard began, his voice steady. "But there were things I couldn't tell him, things I had to keep hidden." McConnell's instincts immediately kicked in. She had seen the way Richard spoke, calm, calculated, like a man who had been living with a secret for far too long. She leaned forward, her attention fully on the witness. Richard continued, his voice tinged with emotion, but there was a controlled edge to it. "I didn't want David to find out about his mother's past. I didn't want him to know about the mistakes I made. I had to protect him from the truth." David's gaze was fixed on his father now, his hands clenched tightly on the defense table. McConnell could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. It was clear that the revelation of his father's secrets was only making David's fragile grip on reality crumble even further. Richard paused, and for a moment, McConnell could have sworn she saw a flicker of guilt cross his face. "I made a choice to keep David in the dark, but that choice, it cost me. It cost all of us. I should have told him the truth." The courtroom fell silent as Richard's words echoed in the room. McConnell felt the weight of what he was saying, but she also felt something else, something deeper, more disturbing. Richard Miller's confession had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Later that evening, as the day's trial proceedings concluded, McConnell sat alone in her office, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Something wasn't right. She had heard Richard's testimony, and on the surface, it seemed like a simple case of a father's guilt. But there was more to it. There always was. Her mind raced as she replayed the details in her head. David had grown up in a family where secrets were kept, where truth was hidden, and where pain was buried under layers of lies. Richard's confession about protecting David from the truth, about keeping him in the dark, had set off a chain of thoughts that McConnell couldn't ignore. What if the truth Richard was hiding was far darker than anyone realized? She dug through her files, pulling up the initial reports from the investigation. Then she reviewed the details of David's family history. His father, Richard, had made a fortune in real estate, but the path to his success had been rocky. It was well known that Richard had been married before,